My fiancé's family demanded, sign this prenup or no wedding. I said, happy to sign. Then I added MY clause, infidelity voids all assets. Her parents' faces when their lawyer confirmed it was legally binding. I, 32 male, have always looked at money as a tool, not a personality trait. I grew up in a household where my dad drove the same truck for 20 years despite owning a successful plumbing business. He taught me that wealth screams, but wealth whispers. I took that to heart. I built a logistics software company in my late 20s that did very well. And while I live comfortably, I don't flash it. I drive a reliable SUV, wear non-branded clothes, and put my money into investments rather than toys. My fiancée, we'll call Sarah, 29F, knew I was well off, but she didn't know the full extent of my liquidity or the trust structures I have in place to protect my assets. We met 3 years ago, and for the first 2.5 years, she seemed grounded. She was ambitious, smart, and seemed to value the same quiet life I did. But looking back, I realized she was just mirroring me. The mask didn't just slip when we got engaged 6 months ago. It was ripped off by her parents. My future in-laws, let's call them Gary and Linda, are the textbook definition of champagne taste on a tap water budget. They live in a leased McMansion, drive leased luxury cars, and are constantly drowning in credit card debt while posturing as high society. For the first few years, they were polite but distant. But the moment the engagement ring went on Sarah's finger, a ring Gary actually critiqued for not being showy enough, they started treating me less like a future son-in-law and more like a hostile takeover target they had just acquired. The entitlement started slowly. It began with the wedding planning. We had agreed on a budget of $50,000, which I thought was incredibly generous. I was covering the cost because Gary and Linda made it clear they were illiquid at the moment due to investments. Linda sat me down one afternoon, waving a dismissive hand over the venue brochures I brought. She told me that Sarah is her only daughter and deserves a platinum package at the city's most historic hotel. She wanted to invite 300 guests, mostly their business associates, not our friends. When I reminded her of the budget, Gary chimed in with a dry, humorless chuckle, saying that traditionally the groom's family handles the heavy lifting if they have the means, and they knew I had the means. I tried to be diplomatic, but the requests escalated rapidly. Gary hinted that his car lease was up, and it would look bad for the father of the bride to arrive in a 3-year-old vehicle. Linda started sending me invoices for pre-wedding beauty treatments that cost more than my mortgage. To keep the peace, I paid some of the smaller ones. That was a mistake. It was just chumming the water for sharks. The breaking point came 2 months before the wedding. I came home early to find Sarah on the phone. Her voice hushed. She hung up immediately when I walked in, claiming she was just talking to her mom about the honeymoon. But the vibe in the house shifted. Sarah became critical of my finances. She started asking specific questions about my portfolio, like why certain money was in a trust, and if we could access cash immediately for vacation home. Then came the dinner. Gary and Linda invited me over for a serious talk regarding the future. I sat on their full leather couch while they sat across from me like a tribunal. Sarah sat between them, refusing to make eye contact with me. Gary poured himself a scotch he definitely couldn't afford and told me they had been talking to their family attorney. They were concerned about Sarah's security because, as a businessman, I take risks. They wanted to ensure she was protected from financial instability. I almost laughed. Usually, the person with the assets requests the prenup. I told them I was open to one, as my lawyer had suggested it, but I hadn't wanted to offend Sarah. Gary slid a thick envelope across the table and told me they took the liberty of drawing one up. He said it was non-negotiable. Sign this, or there is no wedding. I opened the document. It wasn't a prenup. It was a robbery manifest. The terms stated that in the event of divorce for any reason, Sarah was entitled to 50% of my premarital assets, a lump sum cash payout of $500,000 for loss of lifestyle, and lifetime alimony starting immediately upon separation. But the kicker was a clause regarding marital management. It stipulated that upon marriage, a joint account would be created where I was required to deposit 70% of my monthly income, over which Sarah would have primary signatory rights. I asked Sarah if she had read this. She told me she thought it was fair. She said it showed I was committed to us and not just hoarding my money. She gave me the line that if I loved her, I shouldn't care about the numbers. Gary leaned back and told me it was standard for families of their status. He gave me 48 hours to get it signed and notarized, or they would cancel the vendors. They were bluffing, or at least they thought they had me trapped. I was 32, deep in love, and the invitations had already gone out. They banked on the fact that I would be too embarrassed to cancel. I walked out of that house with a pit in my stomach and went straight to my lawyer, David. David has been with me since my startup days. He's a shark, but the good kind. He read the document and laughed, calling it the most unenforceable piece of garbage he'd ever seen. He said a judge would use it as a coaster. But the intent was clear. They were coming for everything. David suggested we cancel the wedding and dodge the bullet. But a cold anger had settled in my chest. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was a betrayal. Sarah had sat there and let her parents try to extort me. She was part of it. I wanted to see how far they would go. I told David to draft a revision. I told him to keep their ridiculous financial demands. The 50% split, the alimony, the joint account. David looked at me like I was insane. Then I told him the catch. I wanted one clause added. A bad faith and fidelity clause. I wanted it ironclad. If the marriage ended due to infidelity, or if infidelity was proven to have occurred during the marriage, the cheating party would forfeit all claims to assets, alimony, and marital support. Furthermore, they would be liable for all legal fees and a penalty some equal to the cost of the wedding. David's eyes lit up. He realized I suspected something. I told him that people this desperate for money and this loose with morals don't change their stripes. If she was loyal, the prenup never hurt me. If she wasn't, they walked into their own trap. David drafted it, making the language so tight air couldn't get through it. 2 days later, I met Gary and Linda. I handed them the revised document and lied, saying I had signed it with one small adjustment my lawyer insisted on, a standard fidelity clause. I explained that if I cheated, they took me to cleaners even faster. But if Sarah cheated, the deal was void. Gary didn't even read the clause carefully. He flipped to the back, saw the financial payout numbers were still there, and his eyes practically turned into dollar signs. Sarah signed. Gary signed as a witness. Linda signed. We got married 3 weeks. Later, the wedding was lavish, expensive, and completely hollow. I watched Sarah dance with her father, both of them whispering and smiling, looking like two con artists who had just pulled off the heist of the century. They had no idea they had just signed a death warrant for their financial future. The first 3 months of marriage were a masterclass in gaslighting. Sarah played the role of the doting wife perfectly in public. But in private, the entitlement ramped up immediately. The joint account clause from the prenup kicked in. I deposited the agreed amount into the account. Within weeks, the money began to drain. It wasn't just household expenses. It was loans to her father for his non-existent business ventures. It was designer handbags for Linda. I watched the bank notifications roll in, saying nothing. I was documenting every withdrawal. I played the long game. I needed them to feel comfortable. I needed them to feel so secure in their victory that they would get sloppy. And they did. About 4 months in, Sarah started having late yoga sessions on Tuesday and Thursday nights. Her phone, previously left on the coffee table, was now always face down. She changed her passcode. I didn't confront her. I called a private investigator named Mike. It took Mike less than a week. He met me at a diner and slid a manila folder across the table. He told me it was Qley, her ex-boyfriend from college, Jason, who was now a personal trainer. She wasn't going to yoga. She was going to his apartment. The photos were explicit, but the texts Mike managed to retrieve were the smoking gun. It wasn't just the cheating that made my blood run cold. It was the involvement of her parents. Sarah had texted Linda saying, "He's getting suspicious about the late nights. I might have to cool it with Jason for a bit." Linda replied, "Don't be stupid. Just tell him you're taking a meditation course. Make sure you keep him happy enough so he doesn't look at the accounts too closely. Once we hit the 2-year mark, the alimony clause doubles. Just stick it out." Gary had even chimed in, telling her to ensure I sign off on a vacation home purchase before doing anything rash because they needed that asset in the trust. They knew they were managing her affair like a business strategy. I felt a cold, hard rage. This wasn't a marriage. It was a long con, and I was the mark. I took the file to David, who confirmed that the established premeditation. This wasn't just infidelity. This was fraud. The 6-month anniversary dinner was approaching. Gary booked a private room at a steakhouse he couldn't afford, expecting me to pick up the check. The week leading up to it was torture. I had to sleep in the same bed as a woman, who looked at me and saw a paycheck. I had to smile when Gary made jokes about how we should invest in a boat to help the family image. The night of the dinner arrived. It was me, Sarah, Gary, and Linda. They ordered the most expensive wine and Wagyu steaks. I sat there sipping water, the manila folder in my briefcase under the table. Gary started talking about the boat again, saying he found a broker. I interrupted him, saying that before we talk about boats, I had a surprise. Sarah smiled, asking if it was jewelry. I told her it was better. It was freedom. I pulled out the folder and set it on the table. I told them I knew about Jason, the yoga sessions, and the texts. The color drained from Sarah's face. She looked at her mother. Linda froze. Sarah tried to stammer that I was being paranoid. I opened the folder and slid the photo of her kissing Jason onto her plate. Then I passed the transcript of the text to Gary and Linda. I told Gary that page 3 was my favorite, where he gave her fatherly advice to stick it out for the alimony bump. Gary turned purple and slammed his hand on the table, shouting about invasion of privacy. I calmly explained that since she was on my phone plan and driving a car registered to my company, I could do whatever I wanted. Sarah dropped the act, sneering that I was boring and worked too much. She said we had a prenup, and if I wanted out, I had to pay. She reminded me that I signed it. Gary regained his composure, puffing out his chest. He agreed with her, saying business is business. He claimed that in our state, infidelity doesn't void the division of assets unless it's specified. He hadn't read the final version I brought back that day. He was so arrogant he assumed I had just capitulated. I asked Gary if he remembered the clause I added, the one he witnessed, the fidelity clause. He frowned. I pulled out my phone and called David on speaker. David's voice boomed through the room, reminding them of Clause 14, Section B. I read it aloud. In the event that the marriage is dissolved due to the proven infidelity of either party, the offending party forfeits all rights to alimony, lump sum payments, and equitable division of marital assets. Furthermore, the offending party agrees to reimburse the aggrieved party for all wedding expenses and legal costs incurred. Gary stared at the paper, his mouth open. Linda looked sick. Sarah claimed it wasn't in the draft. I told her it was in the one she signed while she was too busy counting my money. Gary shouted that it was fraud. I told him it was a contract. I stood up, dropped a $20 bill for my water, and told him to cover the Wagyu because I was freezing the joint account in 10 minutes. The fallout was immediate. Before I made it to my car, my phone blew up with threats from Gary. I blocked them all. I froze the joint account and removed Sarah as an authorized user. The next morning, the legal assault began. They hired a billboard lawyer named Fletcher, who filed for an emergency injunction, claiming I was leaving Sarah destitute. We met in court 2 weeks later. Sarah played the victim, but David was cool as ice. He submitted the text messages as evidence of premeditated bad faith. The judge read the text where Linda told Sarah to stick it out for the money. She looked disgusted. She told Fletcher that his client appeared to have conspired to defraud me before the marriage even began. She upheld the asset freeze. That was the moment Gary realized the money tap was truly off. But the real satisfaction came during the deposition phase. We deposed Gary and grilled him about the loan Sarah had made to him from the joint account. The prenup stated that any transfer over $5,000 required written consent from both parties. Gary claimed Sarah said it was fine, but without my signature, it was an unauthorized withdrawal. Since the marriage was voided by the fidelity clause, those funds were owed back to the estate. Gary owed me $45,000 he didn't have. We did the same with Linda regarding the designer bags and spa treatments. We built a case for civil theft. The final blow came regarding the wedding costs. Gary had co-signed on the vendor contracts to host the event and look big, assuming I would pay the bills. When I stopped paying the balances after the split, the vendors went after him. They tried to settle. Fletcher called David, offering to walk away if I dropped the suit for repayment. I refused. I told David they tried to trap me and coach their daughter to use me. If I let them walk, they'd do it to the next guy. We went to trial. The verdict was swift. The judge enforced the prenup in its entirety. Divorce granted on grounds of adultery. Sarah received 0 alimony and 0 assets. A judgment was entered against her for $85,000, covering half the wedding costs and the funds she siphoned to her parents. Since she had no money, it effectively bankrupted her. The aftermath was a slow-motion car crash for them. Gary filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy 2 months later. The loans he took were exposed as undeclared income, triggering an IRS audit. He lost a leased luxury car, and they had to downsize to a small apartment. Linda emailed me once, blaming Gary for everything and asking for a loan. I forwarded it to my lawyer. Sarah moved in with Jason, but once the money ran out and wage garnishment started, he dumped her. She's now working as a receptionist and living with roommates. I spent a lot on legal fees, but the peace of mind was priceless. I learned that when someone demands you sign a contract, make sure you're the one holding the pen for the final edit. I'm still single, focusing on my company, and if I ever marry again, the prenup